One of my favorite movies is the early Christopher Nolan movie, Memento. In Memento, the main character, Leonard, has sustained a head injury that's left him with the strange condition of not being able to make new memories, which means that while he can more or less make sense of what's going on in the present, every few minutes he has a sensation like waking up, and he doesn't know where he is or why or what he's doing. And the movie is structured, presented to us, the viewers, scene by scene, backwards. So here's a scene, and then the next scene is what's happened just before that, and so on. So that we ourselves are in Leonard's position. We come to each scene with no context and have to hope it'll make sense and fit in somehow down the line. Leonard is looking for someone. He knows that. He has a mission, and that's pretty much all that he knows. And while at any given point he can get a grip on a moment, a piece of his story, he can't see the whole story. I'm put in mind of this character as I see the disciples in our passage in Acts ask the resurrected Jesus in verse 6, "Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" They are fixed on, passionate about one piece of their story, the story they think they're in. But like Leonard, they don't seem to have a sense yet of the scope of the story, where they're headed, and how this piece fits or doesn't into the whole. From this point in Acts, which is really the turning point of one long story, the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts together, from this point, before we look forward, we have to look back. What do the disciples mean? Why would they ask this question? In order to help us look back, I've included in our time a reading of another of the appointed passages for this week from Ezekiel 39, because it captures a big hope, which we find expressed throughout the Psalms, Isaiah and other prophets, and the historical literature, the hope for the restoration of Israel. So Ezekiel is prophesying, writing during the exile, and helping God's people to understand how they've gotten there, what's happening, and why, and where they're headed. For Ezekiel, the exile to Babylon, while painful, of course, it's a national tragedy on a scale we can't imagine. The exile is not finally very mysterious. Ezekiel says that God's people have been exiled, dragged out of the promised land into Babylonian captivity, not ultimately because their oppressors were stronger than them, not because God was powerless to save them, or because he has been faithless to their covenant, but because of their sin, because of their unfaithfulness. That's the deal. You be faithful. You worship only me, as you were made to do. And that's the only shot you've got at that life will work the way it's meant to work. And if you don't, then life will fall apart, and you'll be lost. But even though the people have been unfaithful, in their suffering of the consequences of unfaithfulness, God is still faithful. He still loves them. He is still committed to keeping his promise to Abraham, to bless his family and to bless the whole world through this family. So he promises in our verse 25 in Ezekiel chapter 39 to restore them, to bring them back, to assemble them in their own land. He says in verse 28, I will leave none of them remaining among the nations anymore. And that's interesting because that both did and didn't happen. The exile did end, and the Israelites were eventually allowed to go back home, but not all of them did. Some decided to stay. And from that point on, the people were, to use the term that much later Peter borrows and applies to the Christians he's writing his first letter to, dispersed, scattered. So that by the time of Jesus, even though the exile had ended centuries prior, there was still a strong sense of something like ongoing exile, even at home. And this was deepened by the fact that even though the people were in the land, it wasn't really their land. And their pagan Roman overlords were often oppressive and cruel and made faithful life difficult. All of this, I think, is what's in the disciples' minds in Acts 1. These are the seeds of their hope. It's a biblical promise, a national hope that the kingdom of Israel will be restored. And they've been primed throughout Jesus' ministry to think along these lines. We're reminded at the end of our passage that they had been a group of 12. So their self-understanding as Jesus' disciples had been exactly that they symbolized a restored Israel, the 12 tribes. They're looking for Ezekiel's word to be fulfilled completely. They're looking for their political dreams to be manifested. They're looking to be who they think they've been called to be. And so with all this in their heads, they say, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? And it's interesting because Jesus doesn't say yes, but he doesn't say no. It's kind of a yes and no. And ultimately, the whole rest of the book stands in answer to this question. What is the kingdom? Who is it for? How will it be brought about? But I want to notice a few clues or hints towards something like an answer that we can see here in this passage in Acts. One thing to notice is how Luke begins. And it might be worth glancing back at how he starts his whole long account. This is how Luke begins his gospel, which Acts is a sequel. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, so looking at you, Mark, and maybe Matthew, thanks for the notes, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. So, Luke isn't out to confuse us, although there are puzzles like this one in Acts chapter 1 in his story. He's out to give this disciple and other disciples assurance of the truth of what they've been taught. The name Theophilus means lover of God. So St. Ambrose said, if you love God, it was written to you. Luke and Acts. Okay, so here's how he begins Acts. In the first book, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach. That's important. Luke is very careful. He doesn't say, I've dealt with all that Jesus taught and did, but all that Jesus began to do and teach. That's also been translated, what Jesus initiated, both as a practice and as a teaching. It's critical, I think, to understanding Acts, what it teaches us about the apostles, the growing number of other disciples, the spread and the work of the church as a whole, not only what it meant to be a disciple, to be the church then, but what it means now. It's critical to understanding that we understand that Jesus continues to work. Jesus appears on stage, as it were, only very briefly in Acts, here at the beginning. But the rest of the book is rather haunted, in a good way, with his presence. I think about the movie Memento again. That person Leonard is tracking down. We don't see him. He's off stage. But his presence and his actions give direction to everything that Leonard does. Jesus, throughout Acts, remains at work. And he works precisely through his church. The work of these people, Jesus' disciples, Jesus' church, is an extension of, a carrying forth, a continuation of, a part of his own work. Jesus initiated something and has called us to be part of it. Will he at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? Not at this time. But he continues to work through his church, which is empowered by his Spirit. What else do we notice that hints toward an answer to the disciples' question? Notice that in his response in verse 8, he tells them, "You will be my witnesses." What is it they're witnessing to? Of course, his resurrection, but also specifically his kingship. And I'll tell you why I think that, beyond his use of the language of power and authority. At least two Old Testament stories are echoed here. The first I want to notice, which one of the commentaries I looked at pointed out to me, is the story of the young David. Now, of course, throughout the Gospels, comparisons of Jesus to David abound, but not just general ideas. It's not just the fact that Jesus is, like David, this paradigmatic, great leader of God's people, a man after God's own heart, all that. You'll remember that a huge chunk of the David story, stretching from halfway through 1 Samuel to the beginning of 2 Samuel, concerns the strange period after which David has been anointed as king, but before he takes the throne. He's the true king, but someone else, Saul, is still in power. So he is in danger. He is a man on the run and waiting in the wings with a ragtag group of followers until the time comes when he is enthroned and regarded as the king he truly is. That is the shape of Jesus' life and work. Like David, Jesus is marked at his baptism, but not regarded as king, except by his small band of followers. His life is threatened by the powers that be, whose days are numbered. And we see his disciples here in Acts 1, waiting for him to take hold of his rightful kingship. And closely connected to this is another Old Testament passage echoed, especially by the ascension part of our story in Acts. Daniel chapter 7 seems to have been central to Jesus' own self-understanding. He borrows its language to describe himself. He quotes it. In the passage, Daniel has a vision of God, whom he calls the Ancient of Days, seated on his throne. And then one like a son of man, a human being, comes on the clouds up to God's throne. And we read in Daniel 7:14, to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Jesus, in his ascension, fulfills this vision, taken on clouds to where God is in power. Will he now restore the kingdom to Israel? Not now, but he is the king. And this is just a side note, but I think that the angels are interesting here. Angels in the New Testament always either say, don't be afraid, or they ask why people are doing things. If someone's crying, the angel will say, why are you crying? If someone's looking for Jesus in his tomb at the end of Luke's gospel, the angel says, why are you looking for him here? If someone's standing around looking up, the angel will say, why are you standing around looking up? I think that's just interesting. They always ask that. Why are you doing that? I'm not really sure what to make of that. That's one you can try at home to work out. Maybe just these little calibrations, setting people back on track. Anyway, one more thought about the disciples' question and how the text points us toward an answer. They ask if at this time he will restore the kingdom to Israel. And he responds by commissioning them as his witnesses to proclaim his kingship in Jerusalem and all Judea and in Samaria and to the ends of the earth. The kingdom of God will be a kingdom that's larger than Israel. It will be, as Daniel 7 says, a kingdom of all peoples and nations and languages. He will have dominion, as we read in Psalm 72, from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. Psalm 72 is another important touch point here for this passage and John 17, which is another passage appointed this week. We find throughout the New Testament the idea that someday every knee will bow to Jesus, that his lordship is worldwide, is cosmic, because God intends to redeem all creation. Will he at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? Christ is king of not just Israel, but of all. Finally, something that stuck out to me as an aspect of this story that we might relate to. Jesus calls his disciples to work. He commissions them. He tells them where to go and what to do. Gives them this glorious task of continuing his work and spreading the good news of his resurrection and kingship and salvation from sin. But he also tells them to wait. Wait a while. And so they do. They wait, devoting themselves, we read in verse 14, to prayer. We know God calls us to work, but we have to know that sometimes he also calls us to wait. And the appearance of inactivity or the lack of busyness, having to wait, doesn't mean that we are being disobedient, that we are any less the church. You will never be in a situation where it is impossible to be obedient to Christ. We find the apostles in the book of Acts at the extremes of human experience, undergoing things we can't imagine in our nightmares. And they do what Christ tells them to do, because their circumstances, whatever those are, don't keep them from obedience, from the work of prayer, from the work of love. So, insofar as we ourselves may now just have to wait to carry out what we want to get up to, let's not let ourselves believe that our ability to follow Christ is compromised by our circumstances, because it isn't. May we, like the disciples here, devote ourselves to prayer, to listening for what God would have us do. May we try to see not just a small part of what God is up to, but the big story. And may we be assured, as Paul writes to the Philippians, that God has highly exalted Jesus and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father.